Jordan froze in place at the sight outside his cabin door. A massive grey wolf, battered by the snowstorm, held its frail pup gently in its jaws. Its amber eyes locked onto him before it collapsed from exhaustion. Speechless with shock, Jordan realized that in that desperate look was hidden a silent plea for help that he could not ignore. Perhaps the storm had driven the mother wolf to seek human help. The howling storm outside had amplified the silence in Jordan's cabin as he sat in the old armchair with a half-read book in his hands. Then it happened. A strange sound came from outside the door. At first it was faint, almost drowned out by the howling wind. Jordan tilted his head, listening more closely. The sound came again, clearer this time. A scratching sound, a low moan and howl. The sounds were not creaking logs or trees bending under the weight of snow. He put down the book and stood, each step toward the door slow and careful, instinct warning him to be prepared for anything. When he unlatched the door and pulled it open, a blast of cold air hit him. Jordan froze, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the mother wolf and her pup. The mother wolf was weak, staggering to the ground, but her eyes were still on him. The pup in her mouth was no bigger than a loaf of bread, weak and still, its thin body shivering in the cold. "Oh God," Jordan muttered under his breath, his voice lost in the wind. Without a second thought, Jordan knelt down, ignoring the freezing wind. He reached under the mother wolf and tried to pull her inside. As he placed her gently on the rug by the fireplace, she released her hold on the pup, and Jordan quickly scooped it up. The tiny creature's fur was stiff with ice, its breathing faint. Jordan moved with purpose, grabbing a clean towel from the corner of the room. He rubbed the pup vigorously but gently, his rough hands working to chase away the cold. The wolf pup's small ears twitched, its body shivering in his grip. "Come on, little one," he murmured, his voice low and steady, as though his words might carry enough warmth to help. Wrapping the pup in a thick woolen blanket, he placed it near the fire, then began massaging its tiny legs to restore circulation. Gradually, the pup's breathing steadied, its small chest rising and falling with a rhythm that gave Jordan a sliver of hope. Turning his attention to his mother, Jordan knelt down beside her. Her condition was dire, but there was a fierce resilience in her eyes. He took another towel and wiped the snow and ice from her thick fur. Her fur was rough under his fingers, and there was a distinctive brown mark on her forehead. Jordan took a bowl of warm water and carefully brought it to her lips. At first, she did not respond, but with gentle coaxing she began to lap at the water, her tongue slow and weak. "You're a fighter," he said softly, his words more for himself than the wolf. He worked quickly, draping a heavy blanket over her and tucking it around her trembling frame. The firelight cast a soft glow over her face, and for a moment Jordan thought he saw gratitude in her eyes. She shifted slightly, curling her body closer to her pup, who now let out a weak, almost imperceptible whimper. Jordan didn't sleep that night. He stayed close to the fire, his eyes shifting between the mother and her pup. Every so often, he reached out to check their breathing and touch their fur, ensuring they were warming up. Hours passed in a blur of vigilance and quiet determination. The pup began to stir more frequently, its tiny legs twitching and its ears flicking at the faintest crackle of the fire. The mother remained still, conserving what little energy she had, but her breathing had grown deeper and steadier. At one point, the mother wolf opened her eyes fully and locked them onto Jordan. He met her gaze, unmoving, unsure if he should feel fear or awe. There was no aggression in her stare, only a guarded trust, as if she understood he meant no harm. In the flickering light of the fire, Jordan saw more than two wolves fighting to survive. He saw a bond so fierce, so unyielding, that it transcended the line between man and beast. The mother wolf's determination to protect her pup, even as her own strength ebbed, stirred something deep within him. For the first time in years, Jordan didn't feel entirely alone. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace settled over them. The morning sun crept through the frost-covered windows, casting pale streaks of light across the wooden floor of the cabin. The air inside was still, save for the occasional crackle of the fire that had burned through the night. Jordan sat quietly at the far end of the room, his eyes fixed on the wolf and its young pup resting near the hearth. The larger wolf stirred first, her ears twitching at the faint rustle of Jordan shifting in his chair. Her head lifted slowly, eyes half open, scanning the unfamiliar space with caution. The pup, still curled against her, barely moved, its shallow breathing the only sign of life. Jordan exhaled softly, relieved at the faint signs of recovery. He stood, moving as quietly as possible to avoid startling them, and retrieved a small piece of dried meat from the counter. Breaking it into smaller portions, he set a plate near the wolves, careful to maintain a safe distance. He stepped back, leaning against the wall and folding his arms as he watched. The mother wolf glanced at the food, her gaze shifting quickly back to him, wary and hesitant. Jordan met her eyes briefly, then looked away, aiming to appear non-threatening. For several moments, she didn't move. Then, as if deciding it was safe, she nudged the pup gently with her nose before rising unsteadily to her feet. Her legs trembled, but held firm as she took a cautious step toward the food. She sniffed it carefully, casting quick glances at Jordan between bites. The pup stayed curled where it lay, too weak to follow. Jordan felt a flicker of hope watching the mother wolf eat, knowing she needed the energy to regain her strength and care for her young. Hours passed as the wolves adjusted to the strange safety of the cabin. Jordan made no sudden movements, spending much of the morning tending to quiet tasks. When he did glance over, he noticed the mother wolf's posture was less defensive. She still watched him, but her eyes no longer held the sharp edge of fear. By mid-afternoon, the larger wolf had grown steadier. She moved cautiously around the cabin, sniffing at the wooden furniture and peering at the closed door, as though longing for the wild expanse beyond. Jordan couldn't blame her. He had built this cabin as a refuge, but for a creature like her, it must have felt confining. Her pup remained close to the fire, occasionally twitching as it rested. Jordan checked on it periodically, ensuring it stayed warm and undisturbed. The mother wolf paused near the pup several times, lowering herself beside it and gently licking its fur. Jordan noticed her glancing toward the snow-covered world outside the window, her amber eyes thoughtful and distant. He imagined her instinct to protect and nurture warring with her desire to return to the wilderness. That evening, the three of them fell into an uneasy routine. The wolves stayed near the fire, the mother curled protectively around her pup. Jordan kept his distance, taking a seat at the far end of the room with a book in hand. Occasionally, he read aloud, his voice low and steady, not for the wolves to understand, but to let them grow accustomed to his presence. The mother wolf flicked her ears at the sound, but didn't seem distressed. If anything, the soft murmur seemed to soothe the quiet tension that lingered in the room. When the first light of dawn appeared the next morning, Jordan woke to an uncanny silence. The wolves were gone. He sat up quickly, his eyes darting to the spot near the fire where they had been. The blanket he had draped over the pup lay crumpled, the faint outline of paw prints in the thin layer of ash on the hearth, the only sign they had been there. Throwing on his coat, Jordan stepped outside into the crisp, snow-laden air. The storm had passed, leaving the forest eerily still. He scanned the ground and found a trail of paw prints leading toward the tree line. They were faint, already beginning to fade as the sun warmed the snow. He followed the tracks a short distance before they disappeared into the dense undergrowth. Jordan stopped, his breath visible in the cold air, and stared into the shadowy forest. He felt a pang of loss, but also a quiet satisfaction. They had left on their own terms, strong enough to return to the life they belonged to. As he walked back to the cabin, Jordan found himself replaying the past 2 days in his mind. The image of the mother wolf standing guard over her pup, the way she had cautiously accepted his help, and the quiet moments near the fire all felt etched into his memory. He couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter had been more than chance, a fleeting but profound connection between two very different worlds. Back inside, Jordan sat by the fire, staring at the empty space where the wolves had been. The cabin felt quieter now, almost too still. Yet, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known he was missing. For the first time in a long while, he found himself looking forward to stepping outside again, to seeing what the forest might reveal. Jordan woke up to the soft, muted glow of a winter morning. The air was crisp and biting, the kind that stung your lungs with each breath. After a quick breakfast of coffee and dried biscuits, he bundled up in his thickest coat and boots, grabbing his axe and a small knife from the counter. The firewood pile near his cabin was running low, and with the forecast promising more snow later in the week, it seemed like the perfect day to stock up. He stepped out onto the porch, the door creaking as it closed behind him. The forest was eerily silent. No birdsong, no scurrying animals, just the low hum of wind weaving through the towering pines. Each step left a deep impression in the fresh powder, the weight of his boots sinking into the white blanket. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the trail became less familiar. Still, Jordan pressed on, his mind focused on the task at hand. A subtle unease settled over him, like a whisper at the back of his thoughts. He shook it off, telling himself it was just the quiet playing tricks on him. Yet, as he went further, the feeling gnawed at him, growing stronger with each step. Then he heard it, a deep, guttural sound that froze him in place. His breath caught as he scanned the trees ahead. There, emerging from the shadows of the forest, was a massive bear. Its fur was dark, blending almost seamlessly with the trunks of the trees. Snow clung to its back and shoulders, its movements slow and deliberate. The bear's eyes locked onto Jordan, sharp and calculating. It wasn't curiosity in its gaze, but something far more territorial. Jordan's hands tightened around the axe handle, his pulse pounding in his ears. The bear took a step forward, its massive paws sinking into the snow with a heavy crunch. Another step, then another. Each one was deliberate, the animal's body language growing more threatening with every inch it closed the distance. Its breath came out in visible puffs, the sound low and guttural, like a warning rumble from deep within its chest. "Easy now," Jordan muttered under his breath, taking a slow step backward. His voice sounded strange to him, shaky and small against the bear's presence. He knew better than to run, that would only provoke it, but standing his ground felt just as dangerous. Step by cautious step, he retreated, trying to keep his movements slow and measured. But the bear didn't stop. Its ears twitched, its muscles tensed, and suddenly, with an explosive burst of power, it charged. The ground seemed to shake beneath him as the bear closed the gap. Jordan barely had time to react, his instincts screaming at him to move. He sidestepped as best he could, swinging the axe in a wide arc to keep the animal at bay. The blade caught nothing but air, the bear's momentum carrying it past him, but it was fast, too fast. Before Jordan could gain his footing, the bear wheeled around, snow spraying from its paws as it lunged again. He stumbled, his boot catching on a hidden root beneath the snow. The world tilted as he fell backward, his body hitting the ground hard. The air was knocked from his lungs, the cold seeping through his coat as he lay there, dazed. Above him, the bear loomed, its breath steaming in the frigid air. Jordan's hand scrambled for the axe, but his fingers were numb and uncoordinated. The bear roared, the sound reverberating through the forest, a primal force that sent shivers down his spine. With the axe out of reach and his knife too small to make a difference, Jordan was left with nothing but his bare hands to shield himself. He raised his arms instinctively as the bear swiped at him, the force of its paw knocking his arm aside like a twig. His mind raced, searching for any possible escape, but the sheer size and strength of the creature pinned him down, its hot breath washing over his face. This is it, he thought, a cold clarity settling over him as he stared into the bear's eyes. The forest, the snow, the towering pines. It all seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the immediate danger before him. He could feel the life draining from his limbs, his body paralyzed with fear and exhaustion. The bear reared up on its hind legs, letting out a roar so powerful it shook the trees. Jordan's heart thundered in his chest, his mind racing for a way out. There wasn't one. Suddenly, a sound broke through the chaos. A low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows of the forest. It was different from the bear's roar, sharper, more deliberate. Jordan's head snapped to the side as a flash of silver grey burst through the trees. It was a wolf, powerful and commanding, its movements swift and purposeful. But it wasn't alone. Another wolf followed close behind, smaller but just as fierce, its steps synchronized with the larger wolf. The second wolf, with its youthful agility, moved like a shadow, its fur darker than its companions. Jordan's breath caught in his throat as he watched the pair charge forward, heading straight for the bear. The mother wolf was the first to strike. She lunged at the bear with remarkable precision, sinking her teeth into its shoulder. The bear bellowed, twisting violently in an attempt to shake her off, but the wolf clung on. Her growls were unrelenting, a warning and a challenge all in one. The younger wolf circled around, darting in and out with calculated movements, targeting the bear's hind legs. Together, they worked in perfect unison, their strategy as instinctive as it was effective. Jordan stepped back further, careful not to disrupt the wolf's focus. He gripped the branch tighter, though he knew he wouldn't need it now. His pulse raced, not just from fear, but from an overwhelming sense of awe. The bear let out a frustrated roar, swiping wildly at the wolves, but its size worked against it. It couldn't match the wolves' speed or their coordination. The mother wolf dodged a massive paw, leaping back just in time to avoid a crushing blow. Her pup used the opening to sink its teeth into the bear's side, forcing it to stagger. Snow flew in every direction as the struggle continued, the ground trembling beneath the weight of the combatants. Jordan felt the cold bite of the air on his face, but barely noticed it. He couldn't take his eyes off the battle. He watched as the mother wolf barked sharply, signaling her pup to back off momentarily. She then lunged for the bear's throat, teeth flashing in the pale light of the snow-covered landscape. The bear roared again, this time with a note of desperation. It swung its head wildly, trying to dislodge her, but she held firm. The younger wolf seized the opportunity, darting in once more and snapping at the bear's back legs. The bear faltered, its massive frame tipping slightly as it tried to balance itself. That was all the mother wolf needed. She released her grip on the bear's throat, landing gracefully in the snow and letting out a deep growl. The bear hesitated, its small dark eyes darting between the two wolves. Then, with a final frustrated roar, it turned and lumbered away, retreating into the dense forest. The wolves stood their ground, watching the bear's massive silhouette disappear into the distance. Their breaths came in sharp, visible bursts, the only sound in the now eerily silent woods. Slowly, the mother wolf turned to face Jordan. Her silver-grey fur was streaked with blood, some hers, some the bear's. She locked eyes with him, her gaze sharp and knowing. Jordan let out a shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The mother wolf stepped closer, her movements deliberate, but not threatening. The younger wolf followed, standing protectively at her side. Its dark fur bristled slightly, but its ears perked forward with curiosity. Jordan could see the resemblance now, the way the pup, no, not a pup anymore, mimicked its mother's every move. The mother wolf let out a low huff, her breath misting in the cold air. It wasn't a growl, nor was it a bark. It was something in between, a sound that seemed to acknowledge Jordan's presence, as if to say, "You're safe now." Jordan stood motionless as the wolf met his gaze. The familiar patch of brown fur on its forehead brought an instant wave of recognition. It was the same wolf he had rescued from the bitter snowstorm months ago. The realization struck him harder than the frigid wind whipping through the trees. Here it was again, not as a helpless creature on the brink of death, but as a protector, a savior in its own right. He took a cautious step forward, holding his breath, unsure of how close he could approach without breaking the fragile connection they now shared. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice low and deliberate. The words felt inadequate, but were all he could manage. He knew the wolf wouldn't understand the syllables, but maybe it would sense his gratitude in the tone, the calm in his movements. The wolf didn't retreat, but it didn't come closer either. Its amber eyes stayed locked on him, sharp and calculating, as if it were measuring every move he made. Despite the visible exhaustion in its posture, there was no mistaking the strength it still possessed. Jordan let his eyes drift to the second wolf, a younger one, standing just behind the first. It shared the same intense gaze, though its stance was less steady, one paw lifted slightly off the ground, a reminder of the brutal fight they had just endured. Jordan stopped a few feet away. The wolves were not pets, not companions in the way a dog might be. They were wild, bound to the forest, in a way he could never fully understand or replicate. The older wolf turned its head briefly toward the younger one and let out a soft growl, a sound that seemed more instructional than aggressive. The younger wolf straightened slightly, adjusting its weight on its uninjured legs, and then shifted closer to its mother's side. He thought of how he had found them that night, one desperate to protect its young, the other too fragile to stand, and how far they had come since then. They didn't need him now, not in the way they had before, and that was how it should be. The older wolf seemed to study him for a moment longer, its ears flicking back slightly, as if weighing some invisible decision. Then, with a low, rumbling growl, it turned its gaze back toward the trees. Jordan could see its muscles tensing as it prepared to move. It took a few steps forward, paused, and looked back at him once more. The younger wolf hesitated, limping slightly, before following its mother into the dense cover of the forest. Jordan watched them disappear, their silhouettes fading into the shadows of the snow-laden pines. The wilderness swallowed them up as if they had never been there, leaving only the faint traces of paw prints in the snow. He stood there for a long moment, the silence of the forest pressing in around him. The encounter was over, but the impact lingered, heavier than he could have anticipated. As he turned to make his way back to the cabin, Jordan's mind swirled with thoughts. The image of the wolf, its unwavering determination, its fierce protection of its young, stayed with him. It wasn't just about the act of saving him from the bear, it was what it represented: loyalty, courage, and an unbreakable bond to something larger than oneself. For Jordan, it was a stark reminder of how far removed humanity had become from these primal instincts. The trek back was slow. The path was uneven, and the snow crunched beneath his boots with every step. The cabin wasn't far, but the weight of his thoughts made the journey feel longer. He thought about the choices he had made to live out here, isolated from people, finding solace in the quiet of the woods. Yet, despite the distance he had put between himself and others, he had formed an unlikely connection with something far more untamed. The wolves were not his to claim or control, but in some unspoken way, they had shared a bond that transcended the boundaries of species. Reaching the edge of the clearing where his cabin stood, Jordan paused. The structure looked small against the vast white expanse of the forest, but it was his refuge. Inside, the fire would still be burning, the warmth waiting to welcome him back. But for a moment, he didn't move. Instead, he glanced back toward the direction the wolves had gone, half expecting to see them watching from the tree line. Of course, they weren't there. They had returned to their world, and he would remain in his. The cabin felt quieter than usual as Jordan returned from the woods, the weight of the day's events settling heavily on his mind. The fire crackled softly, casting warm shadows on the wooden walls, but it did little to ease his restless thoughts. He paced the room, his boots thudding against the floorboards, the image of the wolves' fierce battle against the bear replaying vividly in his mind. He could still hear the snarls, see the blur of silver fur as they darted and lunged to protect him. Jordan sank into the armchair by the fire, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. He hadn't just been saved, he had witnessed something extraordinary. It wasn't just instinct that drove the wolf. No, the connection went deeper than that. He thought back to that stormy night, months ago, when he had first opened his door to a desperate, frost-bitten wolf and her pup. That act of kindness, he realized now, had sparked a bond that went far beyond anything he had ever known. The wilderness outside seemed different to him now. Where once he had seen it as a place of solitude and occasional danger, he now saw a symphony of life interconnected in ways he had only begun to understand. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling beams. The rustling of the trees in the wind, the crunch of snow underfoot, even the faint howl of a distant wolf. All of it felt alive, as if every sound carried a message he was just beginning to decipher. For the first time, he wondered if his presence here, this isolated existence, was part of the ecosystem too. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snowy expanse beyond the cabin. The wolf's paw prints from earlier that day were still faintly visible, trailing toward the forest's edge. They weren't just tracks. They were reminders of a story still unfolding. He thought about the risks the wolf had taken to protect him, a human, someone far removed from her world. It was more than just an act of gratitude. It was trust, a bridge between two lives that had no reason to intersect. Jordan couldn't stop thinking about what this meant, not just for him, but for how he viewed all creatures of the wild. In the past, he had approached wildlife with caution, often keeping his distance and regarding them as threats. Now, those notions felt shallow. These weren't just animals. They were beings with purpose, loyalty, and the ability to forge connections as profound as any he'd experienced. It wasn't enough to live alongside them. He wanted to live with them, to understand and respect the roles they played in this vast, intricate system. He began making small changes in his routine. He ensured that his movements through the forest were less intrusive, avoiding areas he knew were frequented by wildlife. He dismantled the few traps he had set years ago but rarely checked, realizing how harmful they could be. He spent more time outside, not to hunt or gather, but simply to observe. He noted how the snow told stories in the form of tracks, each trail revealing the habits and movements of the forest's inhabitants. He marveled at the resilience of the animals around him, adapting to the harsh winter with a grace he could only admire. The wolves did not return, but their absence was felt as much as their presence had been. Every time Jordan stepped out of the cabin, he half expected to see a flash of silver fur or hear the familiar call of the wolf. But they were gone, back to their world, leaving only memories and lessons behind. Yet, he felt their presence in subtle ways, a snapped twig, a faint howl in the distance. It was as if the wolf and her grown pup had become his silent companions, watching over him, even from afar. Sitting by the fire one evening, Jordan stared into the flames and thought about the wolf. "You saved me," he murmured to the quiet room, "and I saved you once. Maybe that makes us even, or maybe it doesn't." His voice trailed off, but the unspoken words lingered in his mind. He didn't need to see the wolf again to feel its influence. It was there, in every choice he made now, every moment he spent reflecting on his place in the world. Jordan's thoughts shifted to the future, to how he could honor this experience. He began sketching plans to adapt his lifestyle further, to live more harmoniously with the wilderness. The idea of coexisting, of being not just a visitor, but a respectful participant in the natural order, became his guiding principle. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a part of something larger, something alive. The wolf remained a quiet presence in his heart, a symbol of courage, loyalty, and the fragile yet profound bond between man and nature. Jordan knew that he might never see her again, but her lessons would stay with him forever. As he leaned back and let the warmth of the fire lull him into quiet reflection, he felt a peace that had eluded him for years. The wilderness wasn't just a place anymore, it was home. Jordan had always been a man of solitude, preferring the quiet rhythm of his cabin life in the woods to the clamor of society. But as the snow melted and spring began to whisper its arrival, he felt a pull to share the story that had forever changed his life. On a sunny afternoon, Jordan found himself at the local community center, a modest wooden building with creaky floors and a lingering smell of coffee. He was no storyteller, and he wasn't used to speaking to crowds. Still, he stood up in front of the room, his rough hands gripping the edge of a lectern, and began to talk. "I never thought I'd be the kind of man to trust a wolf, let alone owe one my life," he started, his voice steady but low. But that's what happened. It all began during a storm. As he shared the details of that night, how the wolf mother had brought her pup to his door and how he'd cared for them, the room fell silent. People leaned forward in their chairs, captivated. Jordan described the encounter with the bear in vivid detail, how he thought he would die, and how the wolves had appeared out of nowhere to save him. "That wolf didn't owe me anything," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "But she came back. She fought to protect me, and she had her grown pup by her side. I don't know if I'll ever understand why, but I know one thing. We're more connected to the wild than we realize." By the time Jordan finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The story resonated deeply, especially with those who had grown up close to nature. Afterward, people approached him, shaking his hand, thanking him for sharing. Some even told him their own stories about encounters with wildlife, moments when they had felt a similar connection. His story wasn't just a tale about wolves, it was a mirror, reflecting a truth many had forgotten. The ripple effects of his words spread farther than he expected. A week later, Jordan received an invitation to speak at a nearby town's conservation group meeting. Encouraged by the warm reception at the community center, he agreed. There, he expanded on his story, talking about the importance of protecting wildlife and preserving natural habitats. "These animals," he said, "aren't just part of the forest. They're part of our story too, and we've got a responsibility to make sure their story doesn't end." As his reputation grew, Jordan began working with local wildlife organizations. Together, they held workshops and talks, teaching people about the importance of coexisting with nature. They built awareness campaigns to reduce human encroachment on wildlife habitats and started initiatives to support the protection of endangered species. Jordan found joy in these activities, a sense of purpose that made him feel more connected to the world than ever before. Sometimes, when he returned to his cabin after a long day, he would sit on the porch and look out at the forest. The wolves had never returned to his door, but their presence was everywhere in his life. He thought about the lessons they had taught him: courage in the face of danger, loyalty beyond reason, and the power of trust. Those moments in the forest had reshaped how he saw the world. They reminded him that nature wasn't something to be tamed or conquered, but something to be understood and respected. Jordan's quiet life had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. He was still the same man who loved the solitude of his cabin, but now He carried with him the voices of the community, the stories of others inspired by his experience, and the memory of the wolves who had become more than just animals to him. They were a symbol of something greater, a reminder of the wildness and wonder that still existed in the world and within himself. If this story touches your heart, please share it with someone you care about. Maybe it will remind them of a time when they felt connected to something bigger than themselves. And if you believe in protecting wild places and the creatures that share this earth with us, don't stop here. Get involved, support local conservation efforts, or even just take a moment to appreciate the world outside your window. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, or even tell me about your own experiences. Together, we can keep these stories alive and maybe even inspire others to see the world a little differently.